All right, my name is Randy Bissell, and my wife Dawn is here with me today. And we're both geologists, we're both professional geologists, living in Corpus Christi. We've lived there for about 20-something years. This hitch, we were here in the 80s. And we're both members of the Corpus Christi Geological Society. And our Geological Society, recently we downsized our headquarters, and we had a lot of fossil bones and materials that have been collected over the years. And those things had no home. Well, right now they're stacked in my living room. And so what we've been doing is working with different groups here on the Gulf Coast in the area to place our orphan bones. And the Aransas History Center, this little museum, is a delightful place to share some of these artifacts with you guys on behalf of the Corpus Christi Geological Society, for you guys to hold and possess these for future exhibits, and also as our desire was to be able to put some of these bones that young people and old people would only see behind glass, is to put them out there and let people physically connect by touching these artifacts, physically connect with the history of our coastal bend in its rich, I think it has a rich geological history. And it's fun to talk about and think about what the past was like. My other title, and my wife as well, we're both Texas Master Naturalists from the South Texas chapter in Corpus Christi. We cover Nueces, Clayburgh, and Kennedy counties down south, mostly Corpus Christi and Kingsville. And why that's relevant is, and really the merger of those two is that these fossils and this story really is the key component of our landscape here on the Texas coast. And so as naturalists that are involved in conservation, preservation, education, we when we speak of what's going on in terms of the ecosystem, we can't, as geologists, we can't divorce the modern ecosystem from the geological story. Because all of these, when somebody says estuary, you know, when you're not a geologist, when you're a biologist, an estuary is a place, right? That when a biologist talks about an estuary, they talk about it as if it's a place, a thing or a place. When a geologist talks of an estuary, we think of the process by which this place has come into being and what its vulnerabilities are as things change. Because geology is the long, slow science of the earth. And so we have to take into consideration a longer fetch. And so as a master naturalist, one of the things I've been working on is public education around the rich geological history of our area. And here's the formula, okay? This is, as I've learned in these last few years as a naturalist, is that in order to achieve conservation, right? I mean, whose goal is it to have conservation? Who wants to be a conservationist? Everybody, right? So in order to get to conservation, okay, we have to start with appreciation. So I can go out there and harangue people and abuse people and threaten people and shame people about taking care of the world. But if I don't start with generating appreciation, I can never get to conservation. But I think sometimes we spend too much time over here in trying to force people or make people conserve, and we forgot the hard process of education and appreciation, those quiet moments, the time that we have to instill in young people to help them see, because we want those young people to appreciate it, take it into their heart, and when they become older, then they start to manifest conservation and even restoration of the natural world. And I joke that restoration is such a noble goal, but the S in restoration is always a dollar sign. Because restoration is very expensive. And so these young people are going to have to make financial decisions that to commit to restore and preserve these habitats. And that's the master naturalist role. So I find myself merging our interest, which is professional geologists. Dawn and I are both professional geologists. Corpus Christi Geological Society, we've both been members of the Geological Society for eons and involved in that leadership. And then also Texas Master Naturalist, which gives us a natural vehicle for which we can talk about these aspects of our discipline that I think speak to enriching people's understanding of our area. And it's a lot of fun. And this is where I was talking in the other room about my personal interest. I am not a fossil guy. I mean, I'm not. But I am a process guy, a geological. I love thinking about geological processes. And I'll speak on that here in a second, but I won't bore you with that yet. And so I'm fascinated by the world that this represents. I'm fascinated by these things, of course, but to me it's the world and it's the thinking about that world that's really cool. So I'll talk about some cool stuff. All right. So what I brought today was an assemblage of things that I thought it would give me whatever I want to talk about. I mean, I'll talk about what y'all want to talk about, but I like talking about what I want to talk about. And each thing I picked was something that would be a part of that. A part of that, my own personal, what I like to talk about. So one of the things I like to think about when we talk about these Pleistocene animals is their size. Now, if we go back and think about the Pleistocene epoch, you guys have all heard of the Pleistocene. Those geological epochs that have been established, and you've heard some of these words like Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian. Everybody's heard of Jurassic Park, and everybody's heard of the Cretaceous, right? And then when we get into the more recent stuff, we've all heard of the Miocene and Pliocene and Pleistocene and Holocene. These geological periods are geology is kind of simple. And so when we look at a rock record or the earth history, we kind of organize events into these periods that we label. And we do that to give ourselves a vocabulary about geological time. And so, yeah, I might say, yeah, I'm talking about the Pleistocene. And so amongst geologists and people who are informed, oh yeah, I'm talking about between about 2 million years ago and 12,000 years ago. That's the Pleistocene. And that geological period has got some common characteristics to it. And so in those common characteristics, we see things in the landscape, we see things in the animal assemblage, but those terms are not, that while the word exists, the time ranges vary over, because we'll make little adjustments in the time ranges of the Jurassic or the Cambrian or the Pleistocene. But you just realize that that's really more of a vocabulary than a written in stone strict time period, you know? And so when we go back and talk about it, so when I talk about Pleistocene animals, we're talking about animals that were around from about 2 million years ago, 2.8, some people say 2.2, some people say 1.8. But the Pleistocene is the most recent geological period before the present. The present geological period is called the Holocene. Okay? And the Holocene is kind of the Nowocene. It's the world as it's been for the last 12,000 years. 11,700, I think, is to be specific. And really what that represents is the end of the last ice age, the Wisconsin Ice Age. Now, people can't appreciate the Wisconsin Ice Age. I mean, if I tell you about the Wisconsin Ice Age, I get shivers because it's cold. Now, I get shivers when I think about this, because at the end of the Wisconsin Ice Age, sea level was about 400 feet lower than it is today, 12,000 years ago. Let's take a minute and think about it. 400 feet. To go to the beach, you'd have had to drive another hour because sea level was lapping up against the continental shelf, 60 to 80 miles out from the present day coastline. Down 400 feet. This bluff in Rockport and Fulton, this sand bluff that now sits about 15 to 20 feet above sea level, would have been in the distance a sand ridge of a 400-foot hill. That you would have seen this topography, if you were out on the coastal plain, you'd have seen this slow rise to a ridge. And that ridge, that first hump along the coast, would have been this trend, this sand hill that goes all the way from the King Ranch to Pascagoula, Mississippi. This ridge, this sand ridge. And so it's hard to imagine. It would have been a cooler, drier world because that 400 feet of sea level is now caught up in an ice cap that covers a lot of North America. All that fresh water would have been sucked up, and so our climate would have been overall cooler and drier, more like the climate in southern Canada today. Because the ice cap is, I mean, you could measure, so we would have been a cool temperate climate, okay? The summer could have been quite warm because we're still fairly close to the equator. So the animals here, and then the prevailing ecosystems would have been grassland prairies, grass and scrub. Not unlike today, but probably more cold weather grasslands. Again, take whatever climatic band is to the north of us and think about, you know, the grasslands of Minnesota or the upper Great Plains, and you just kind of move that south into our region of grasslands. And so we had organisms, we had an assemblage of organisms that thrived in those savannas, those grasslands along a coast that was, I mean, so we think about ourselves on the coast here. Well, you know, 11,000 years ago, this wasn't the coast. This was Skidmore, or Mathis, or Beeville, you know, so we were that far. I mean, people in Beeville don't talk about themselves being on the coast. And so that's where we would have been here, and it would have been, and so a herd of, I think back, you think about the way the herds of animals on the African savanna. Yes, we had herds of mammoths and mastodons, herds of camels and North American horses. We had herds of not just the bison, the modern bison. We had an ancient bison that was almost twice as big as the modern bison. We had what have been referred to as megafauna, which are, I've heard a definition, megafauna weigh more than 100 kilograms. Okay? And so a megafauna, although humans didn't, well, maybe some weighed more than 100 kilograms, but humans were in the mix. Okay? Because when these episodes of sea level being so much lower, when sea level is at 300, 400 feet lower than it is today, and there's ice and there's other, you can literally walk from Siberia to Alaska. And so as much as 25,000 years ago, people came over and came into the Americas, and certainly by the time Columbus, whatever he did, found us yet again, human beings had populated from the tip of Tierra del Fuego all the way into Alaska. So those few people that came across ended up populating the entirety of the North and South American continent. All right, so 13,000 years ago, there were most certainly people in North America, and there were these megafauna. And so the first thing we talk about is the size of these fauna, and that's why I bring this little leg and hip assembly, just to get you the impression of, well, if this is his femur or his humerus, you know, this is a part of a leg structure, then you go, well, this organism must have been huge, and yeah, he was so big that I could walk under him. He was as big as any large elephant today, if not slightly bigger. The Columbian mammoth was an impressive beast. And in Waco, Texas, they found several of these organisms that they've excavated, and there's a mural there of a full-size Columbian mammoth, and they are a huge organism. And they were not uncommon. That's the other thing that people can't appreciate, is that in order for us to find so many pieces of evidence of this organism all over the planet, they were abundant. This was their world, and we were the less common organism than these large megafauna. Okay, but the mammoth was called a mammoth because when they started finding the bones, that's what these are mammoth. These are mammoth bone, mammoth creatures, you know, and so that's how it got its term, the mammoth. I also brought, just for fun, a piece of a skull of a mammoth. This is a piece of skull and a tailbone of a mammoth, and a tooth of a mammoth, and a tusk, a piece of tusk. This is made of ivory, same kind of ivory of an elephant. If we had a Columbian mammoth, here's a nice Columbian mammoth. Of course, he's bigger than this, right? We had a Columbian mammoth, you know, so this is a piece of preserved tusk. This is his tailbone. This is part of his skull, and this would be a part of his humerus and shoulder, okay? Y'all have any questions about that? And so let me just show you the tooth. This is a mammoth tooth. And so you'll notice that the mammoth tooth is a flat tooth, a ridge tooth, not unlike the surface of a horse or camel tooth. And it's a similar structure because they're both grass and hay eaters. And so the animal had evolved to be able to chew grass, which contains silica. And so they had these grinders that would grind the hay. Now, here's a cool question. When they started finding these mammoth teeth in North America in the late 1700s, when people started to really get interested in this, 1750, 1780, they started finding these things. Who do you think first said this came from an elephant?
Somebody who had a horse?
No. The Africans that had been brought over, that were enslaved, freedmen, but the Africans started to tell people, you know, that looks like an elephant tooth. And people were like, no, get out of here. There are no elephants in North America. And lo and behold, by the late 1700s, they were finding entire creatures. And they were bewildered about what they were. And they were, so they were finding these elephant-like teeth, same size as elephants, and they had been turned on to that must be a creature similar to an elephant. At the same time, information was coming out of Russia that they were starting to recognize similar organisms that were like this, and so there was a growing consensus that there was an organism that wasn't around anymore, that was an elephant-like organism that had one time occupied North America. And Europe and Russia, but these were no longer with us. And because of what had been written which is nothing, by these indigenous people, just didn't have a detailed language from which to speak of these things. They started to. It took a while to put two and two together. Now we come back. They did. I don't want to shortchange those folks because people in Europe and in the Americas had documented the presence of megafauna with their cave drawings and petroglyphs, right? So the cave paintings of Lascaux and other places in Europe, the cave paintings of New Mexico, all show that people were infatuated with these megafauna. And they were also hunting them, because there were pictures of people with arrows, bow and arrows, and atlatls. There were people that were hunting these animals as depicted in the cave paintings. So these animals were important to human development, obviously as a food source, okay? But anyway, that was kind of the story in North America, that North American naturalists in the late 1700s, along with some of the casual in-the-field identification, started to believe that there was a whole suite of organisms that had existed in North America that were either no longer here, or, as one famous naturalist believed, though they would be found in the western United States. So, one of the famous naturalists, you may recall his name. You know what I'm talking about?
Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson. This is a tooth. This is a replica tooth of a tooth that Thomas Jefferson had. That was not a mammoth tooth. Because why do we know this is not a mammoth? It has pointed teeth. Okay, it has these pairs of pointed protrusions on the teeth. And so here's a mastodon tooth from South Texas. It's a little bit harder to identify because it's kind of broken up, but you can tell it's not the same tooth. So this is a mammoth and a mastodon. Well, we know today that a mastodon is a relative of the mammoth, but he's not a mammoth. He's a little different. He's a little smaller. His tusks are a little different. His head structure is a little different. His teeth are a little different. So he's living at the same time as the mammoth, but he's got a different diet, and they coexisted in different niches. An elephant-like organism that's coexisting at the same. So we have mammoths and mastodons together at the same time, but they're somewhat different organisms because and they're identified not only because of the bone structures, the skull structures, but because of the teeth structures as well. You know why this is called a mastodon, don't you? Why would this? I mean, we know why a mammoth's called a mammoth, right? Because it's big. So Jefferson had talked to other naturalists at the time and was thinking, well, they're finding bones that are assemblages in northern Kentucky, southern Ohio, at the Big Lick. They were finding these creature bones that were huge, and they were associated with these kind of teeth. And so Jefferson and some other naturalists at the time had this vision that this was a carnivore. Mm-hmm. And they imagined an upright beast like a bear with these kind of teeth that must be huge, upright, with big walrus-like tusks, because they were finding tusks. So they had I wish I had a picture. Jefferson sketched what he thought the Incognitus americanus looked like. And it's like a child's drawing of this fierce beast. Well, so he shipped some, or an associate of his in France, he sent some mastodon teeth over, and his French associate, looked at these teeth, and he goes, well, first, my name for this tooth is going to be different. He goes, when I look at this, I see pairs of breasts on the tooth. And so we will call this organism mastodon, which means breast tooth. Which is I'm not going to pick on the French, but that's a great name from a Frenchman. I could see him looking at it going, ooh, I know what I see. the mastodon, and so he named this organism the mastodon for its tooth. And then as we grew in our understanding, we began to realize that the mastodon was an elephant-like version. They started assembling them more correctly and came to the understanding that we weren't looking at one organism or different, we were looking at similar organisms that had a different tooth structure. A tooth structure not unlike a goat or a pig or us, where we're omnivores. Or they weren't omnivores, but they were eating more brushy material, and so these are more cutters, and so he would be eating underbrush, scrubby, and he's eating grass. And that's the distinction is in the tooth structure, which when we come back to paleontology, paleontology is a great detective game because they have to look at things like this and imagine, well, what these organisms, we can't go like watch a video of mastodons eating. We have to figure out that part of being a paleontologist is to use whatever evidence you have to have a better understanding of the organism. And the last thing I'll say about Jefferson and the mastodon is that Jefferson, because he came before Darwin's writings, Jefferson did not have the word extinction in his vocabulary. So people think that Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark out to look for the Wild West. One of the things he charged them with was, you go find me these giant extinct organisms if they exist in the West. That was part of his hope and then they came back and reported, there's a lot of people out there, but there's not a lot of, we're not finding these organisms. Okay, so and this is a piece of a horn of our large bison from the past, and then like I said, I showed the camel tooth. So these organisms, were these. Well, they weren't just mammoths and mastodons. We had another popular organism here in South Texas. People like to call this a saber-toothed tiger, and I notice that's what's over on your display. But they really weren't tigers. They weren't saber-toothed tigers. They were saber-toothed cats. They're akin to other North American cat species. Tigers are very specific to Asia, right? And so a tiger, while it is also a cat, to call this a saber-toothed tiger is a little bit of a misnomer. We'll just call it a Smilodon, which is what the genus of these. Smilodon fatalis, I believe, is the Latin name. Fatalis. I wonder what that has to do with, a Smilodon fatalis. And so the Smilodon was a saber-toothed cat that lived here in South Texas, concurrent with pumas and other cats that are still extant, still existing. This was that went extinct in the last few thousand years here. And this is a little model of him. Here he is. And then, the artistic license, what do they do with my saber-toothed cat? They put stripes on him, And why? Because they want to make kids go, oh, a saber-toothed tiger. And they kind of make him look like a tiger. But we don't know. I don't know. Maybe he had, a lot of paleontologists are putting feathers on dinosaurs. Maybe he had feathers. I don't know, Anyway, saber-toothed cats. And these have been found here in South Texas. This is a model skull. This is because I couldn't afford a real one, but it's really great. It's a fantastic piece, and my cats liked it when I put it out on the back patio. They do. They lay around it, which is pretty awesome. The other thing that we find here, and I know she's got some examples over there, we find different vertebrae. We can find these teeth. We can find other parts and pieces of a lot of different organisms. The giant sloth, which for some reason or other has his tongue out, and he's in the picture, the giant sloth. And this guy was 12 feet high. He's huge. These are huge organisms. You put these teeth in one of these, and you're like where Jefferson was, and some walrus tusk, and he's like, oh, that's a giant carnivore. You wouldn't want to. If he was carnivorous, you wouldn't want to run into him, but they were just throwing bones together and seeing what they could come up with. And then we had the Glyptodon, and I got introduced to the Volkswagen in the front, and Glyptodons were about the size of the Volkswagen Beetle, and they were armored, they were giant armadillos, and some of them had a tail that actually had barbs on it, like a stegosaurus. They had these barbed and fighting tails. And so recently there were a handful of these found at one site in Brazil, I think it was, where a guy started digging out in his garden, and he found one, and then he found another, and it looks like a guy sitting amongst some Volkswagen Beetles, because now they've excavated all of them. But these were, again, I want to come back, and this is what's really beautiful about the Dinah Bowman painting, is that that depicts a world where all of these animals are existent and common, and that's very much something that we need to remember is that this world was not a small place. This was a lot of the Gulf Coast of the United States and then down into Mexico. This was an extremely prolific and productive habitat during that time. We tend to look, and as a paleontologist, geologist, we tend to look back in the past and we frame everything as if, it's all compared to the now. But what you have to remember is you take 8 billion people off the planet and reduce it to a few hundred million. That leaves a lot of room for everything else. And so the Earth, through geological history, has always been extremely productive. And so when there's not one dominant species, or that during that, I was reading a book about the Jurassic and Cretaceous and the dinosaurs. People can't comprehend how common dinosaurs were, and it's revealed by how often their fossils are found. And so for an organism to be found commonly, there must have been a lot of them, because those few remains have to endure through long periods of time, even though, like mammals, are just not subject to easy preservation, because our bones literally dissolve right back into the earth. And so you might find a tooth which isn't prone to dissolution, but the fact that we find so many bones in one locale or in many locales, it just tells us we should get a sense of how prolific these organisms were.
So to be preserved, what has to happen?
Well, it's really great. Now, a lot of the things that we find here related to the Pleistocene are original material. In other words, these are still calcified bones. These are bones. These are the bones that have not been altered. And as long as this bone doesn't get altered, it's going to be prone to eventual dissolution and reincorporation into the earth. The best thing that can happen is that the water table of the water and the silica in the water, or the calcium carbonate, these minerals, start to do a replacement of some of the cellular structure. And that there's some hope, like in petrified wood, which is silica replaced wood cells, or woody cells, there's some hope that those cells get replaced by a more durable mineral, and that adds a longevity. I do have at home, I didn't bring it, it's 2 almost exact pieces of a large bone, one of which has been original shell material or original bone material, and the other has been calcified or silicified because it was in a gravel deposit. And they're almost identical, but then the silica bone is much harder and it's more durable, and of course it would lend itself to preservation. So we're hoping, when things are buried and preserved, of course a tooth is made of basically an apatite or calcium sulfate. There's a hope that some of the parts of us are more durable, but the bones are not, and they tend to fall apart. But that's what we require, some kind of mineral replacement. Now, this question comes up: well, what is a fossil? I like that question. That's one of my favorite questions for kids. I ask kids, like, well, what's a fossil? And some people think that a fossil is only a mineral replaced something. But a fossil, in its most loosey-goosey term, is any evidence of past life. And so if we, and I would add to that, any evidence of past life from a prior age, geological age. And so if I find a track or a trace, a footprint, that's a fossil, that's a trace fossil. If I find a bone, that's a fossil. If I find a remineralized bone, that's a fossil because it's evidence of past life. If I find a piece of what we call a coprolite, which is excrement from an animal, if we find it fossilized, if we find it remineralized, and I have a nice big turd at home, a dinosaur turd, but that's a fossil. That's a trace fossil of an organism. Why? Because it speaks to something about a life in the past. And so, you know, those are all fossils. And so, as a geologist or as a paleontologist, there's a rock hound. We're always out there looking for these little pieces of evidence of past life from a prior period. Or even from and when we transition that to the modern period, we transition from paleontology to archaeology, right? And it's a fuzzy distinction because, you know, I've got these creatures that are extinct that survived into the Holocene that were probably pressured and hunted to extinction by this guy. You know, so is he a part of archaeology and anthropology, or is he a part of geology and paleontology? He kind of gets to jump across, right? Because he's back here and he's hunting these guys, and then he's with us today. So right, that's right. All right, so he's doing all that stuff. All right. And that's why I brought him, because I want to, talk about him for just a second. So I'll stop right here for a second and say, are there any questions? I've covered a lot of material.
Yeah, can you imagine somebody with an atlatl attacking a mammoth?
Well, we're going to talk about that. Thank you.
Oh, good idea.
That's a great idea. That's why I brought my atlas. So last weekend at Mustang Island State Park, all of the Texas parks are celebrating the 100th anniversary of Texas State Parks. And I want to encourage you guys, next weekend, Goose Island is going to be celebrating their 100th anniversary of Texas State Parks. With Sarah's going to put on the extravaganza. And a part of that is we're going to have atlatl throwing as a part of that event. I'm going to be up there talking about Spanish exploration. And but the atlatl is a device that was developed probably on the order of 40 to 50,000 years ago in Europe. And what it did was, I'll do it. Y'all want to hear this? You want to hear about atlatl? Because I love atlatl. I got one for Christmas. I got 3 for Christmas. And so when this guy started out, right, and he's hunting these giant creatures, his first option was a pointed stick. Now, if I had a mammoth right there and I got a pointed stick, what is the problem with that? Is there a problem? I mean, I can have a whole bunch of us with pointed sticks, and that mammoth is going to go, those monkeys with sticks are a nuisance. And so he's like, so the only way I can get enough force is to hold it. Right? Well, I've got to do something better than that. And so let's make a stick a stick that we can throw. Now, they don't have steel. They just have material. They just have wood and stone and feathers. And so I can throw it. Well, the problem with throwing something is that from the moment it leaves my hand, it starts to slow down. And so I've still got to be pretty close, and I've got to be pretty strong in order to throw it. And it's going to have, I'm not saying they weren't lethal, but they weren't effective. And so then somebody, I don't know who it was, they didn't write it down, came along and said, well, what if I have a stick? What if I could make my arm, I could add another joint to my arm and have that much more leverage. And I could take a dart or a spear, and I could throw it, and when I throw it, I'm still accelerating. And then the other thing that's happening, as I'm accelerating quickly, I'm slightly bending the dart, right? Because inertia is creating a bend. And so when this thing leaves the tip and it straightens, it actually accelerates off the tip. So I can deliver a spear with 10 times the force of throwing it. Now we're talking. And so they developed, we're talking, 20 to 50,000 years ago in Europe, they're developing a technology that becomes a very effective hunting weapon with different sizes and styles of atlatls, different sizes and styles of darts, different sizes and styles of points. And they're creating a technology that is extremely effective for hunting at a longer distance. Fewer people get hurt or killed when you're out there doing this. And it creates an efficiency that like human beings always do, we create tools that are efficient. And we continue to improve. I guarantee you, the darts I'm making today, this is a pretty good looking dart. I made this in my backyard. This is the second dart. It looks way better than the first dart. The next dart I make is probably going to look way better than this dart. And the idea is that I'm refining my own fletching. I'm refining everything as I make them. And why am I doing it? This is the naturalist in me. I want to experience the building of my own dart. And what I don't get is how they made these without hot glue. Because hot glue is quite the technological innovation. And so I pretend when I'm putting that hot glue on this stuff, I'm like, that's just buffalo snot is what that is. It's just my buffalo snot. Because they were using different parts and pieces of animals for their adhesive. But you can't do this quickly without hot glue and spray paint. But anyway, so that's where they were going with this stuff. And there's been a lot of research on these, and these are also in the cave paintings of the Americas. So obviously that technology came across with the people across the Bering Strait. And so there are cave paintings in the Americas that show that the atlatl was in use, 15,000 years ago, 13,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago. And in fact, all the way up to the time that when Cortez arrived in the Aztec world in Central America with the Mexican and the Aztec, guess what they had? They had atlats. And they were very effective weapons against the Spanish. No match for the Spanish armor, a Spanish soldier on horseback with his pike and his sword and his primitive gun the atlatl was no match for the Spanish on horseback, but they still struck fear because this was certainly capable of penetrating at least the chainmail, if not the larger ones, really putting a dent in the armor. And so the Aztecs were using atlatls to hunt with. What's else I going to say about
So the atlatl term is a Norwal term, an Aztec.
Right. ATL, owl, is like a Norwal. There's a lot of the ATL ending, and so atlatl is our atlatl is a modern. It has etymology back to those terms. What they call them, we don't know. Because y'all are interested in. I'm reading history all the time, and I was reading this history about the conquest of the Mexia people, and one of the things that they pointed out as a technological advantage of the Spanish was written language, because Cortez could give written instructions to his lieutenants, and they would follow those instructions word for word, and so he could coordinate an assault with that written, messenger and written communication. Well, the Mexican people, they had language, but they didn't have a strong codified written language. They were illiterate for the most part. And so their commands could get lost. Or if their messenger got killed, then who takes the message on? And so the ability to communicate and coordinate was a vital part of Spanish conquest. And it's like, I'm sitting there reading that, and I go back and I stop and I go, I gotta read that again. Because I never thought about that. And that even communication itself, the ability to write, was important. And so, yes, to answer your question, we probably, without those native tongues, we can speculate what they would have called this. And we can recount from Spanish history what the Spanish thought they were calling it. But in terms of a real uniform and codified language, we're doing our best guess. And one of the other terms that I've got to make me one of these or get me one of these is the Aztec War Club. Are you familiar with the War Club? The Aztecs had this cricket bat war club that was ringed with obsidian shards. This is a piece of obsidian. And it was this hacking, whacking, cutting, awful device that they would, in the heat of battle, they would run out with these things and they'd start slinging this device, and the Spanish hated them because the sole intention of this was injury, not death. Now, apparently these things were really bad. I mean, there are descriptions by the Spanish where a good swing of one of these would take a horse's head off. Okay? They were fierce and they were hated. So much so that the Spanish ordered the destruction of all of them. And so there was one remaining in a museum in Spain, and it was lost in a fire. These were so hated that they don't even have them anymore. They ordered the destruction of all of them. But I want to get one because you can buy them on eBay. But or I can make one from a cricket bat. But the point is that that human beings, we're warlike, we like war, and we develop these technologies. And what probably starts for one purpose ends up becoming a purpose of something else. But yeah, he's really important in the story. Yes.
I saw something in a museum in Wisconsin that had very old arrows, and they have blood grooves.
Yes, they did.
Did those predate the bow? Were those also used with atlatls?
Yeah, for sure.
Because that would have made him bleed. It wouldn't have killed him, but it would have made him bleed, which means that they could follow him.
Oh yeah. Well, that's a great point. There's a really nice poster here, and I want to study it on the other side of this wall, showing all the different point types that have been found. And again, these people. Again, when I taught historical geology, I spent a section of. I used to teach at university, and we'd spend the last 2 weeks talking about human evolution and people. And early on, I had to remind students, and I had to remind myself, that when we think about a human being 50,000 years ago, a Homo sapien, he's just as much an us as we are, as you are. He is a fully conscious emotion, technology, angst, worry, concerns, family, love. He is completely human. He's not lesser human. He's all of us. And you know what? His observations, if he could refine something to make something with the tools and techniques he had at hand, he would do it. So I think as we find more about the history and we look whatever's preserved, I think we're gonna be amazed by the innovations that were occurring. So it would not surprise me at all, those levels of sophistication. That we would start to detect and see those levels of sophistication in those things that we find. That like, even greater detail, you know? And what they lacked, again, we'll come back to that communication thing, what they lacked is the development of the technology that allowed the communication to future generations of those cumulative details. Because, you know, think about today, you know, information age, today, all of that breadth and depth of history is available to us if we go look for it. To those guys, they were like, but they were one of us. So there tends to be a prejudice toward ancient people. And I don't live with that prejudice. I live with a respect and admiration. And that's part of, from teaching about Spanish conquest of South Texas. The Spanish people were so ill prepared for the New World compared to the people that lived here. The Taranquas and the Calicans and the other people, Copanos that lived along our coast, had so developed a civilization in an inhospitable area. And the Spanish would just basically come here to die. You look on the De Pineda's 1519 map, there's a big blank spot. I mean, there's Florida and Cuba, and then there's Mexico, and then there's this big flyover country. It's like, you don't want to go there. There ain't nothing there. Nothing there but angry people. You just don't even stop. Because there's no gold, and there's a lot of sand, and there's some really, what do they call it? Huh?
The tacos?
The
There was a
Taranco.
name for it. There was a name for it that the Spanish had.
For the Texas coast?
That whole area of Texas, and it was some sort of desert. Dead
Wild
horse?
Horse Desert? Or,
Dead horse?
no, well,
Desert or
we're talking before there were horses there. I mean, it was just, I mean, we were called the Wild Horse Desert for a long time, but that was really after about 1650.
But they weren't really prepared for the Spanish either, because they brought disease to them. So.
All right, well, let's talk about that too. You know, I said the Spanish soldier was formidable, and he was formidable in his armor and all that, but he did have smallpox, measles, and
Right.
influenza, which the native people had no resistance to, which was killing people ahead of the Spanish. And so the Spanish were taking venereal disease back to Europe with them, you know, syphilis, but the diseases, which was not, I mean, it's fatal, but it takes a longer time. But these people, I mean, these villagers, the people of the New World, by the time we get to 1650 or 1700, the millions upon millions of native people have been lost to disease. And it was an insidious, you know, it was insidious how it moved in ahead of I mean, what conquered the New World was probably disease. And the repeating rifle.
Yeah, talk to us a little bit about the evidence here in South Texas.
Okay.
And the different sites.
Okay,
that are
so
around.
that's a great segue. You've got a list of our native of sites around here where we find Pleistocene and early American, you know, Native American people and see these pieces of evidence. One of the richest Pleistocene megafaunal sites in the world, and certainly in Texas, is at the Blunser in Nueces County, right? The gravel deposits of the Nueces River. And over the last 50 years, the gravel's been, or I'd say almost 100 years, the gravel's been mined. But in the last 50 years, there's been an effort to preserve the different fossils that come out of there. Virtually all of these genuine bona fide fossils are from that site. And the Corpus Christi Geological Society had a relationship with the gravel pit for a while. We used to lead an annual field trip out there and take kids out there and pick through I don't know if y'all ever been out for one of those trips. They were awesome, but because of the times we live in, the liabilities, so those trips are no longer allowed. I will say this, is that at the present time, to my knowledge, there are no universities supervising or studying the things coming out of those pits. And so there's nobody. Paleontology as a discipline in geoscience has become less popular. We don't have a lot of paleontology students anymore, or people that are interested in fossils. I guess that's somehow people believe we found everything that ever needs to be found. But the absence of people doing that research or the funding for that research means that we don't have scientists working in those pits. And I assure you that every day that pit is in operation, they're dragging out teeth and bones and pieces of organisms that we can identify and organisms that may not have yet been identified. So that's kind of a sad state of affair for a world-class site like that. Otherwise, around the coastal bend, whether it's in Ingleside, here in the Bluff, as far north as Goliad and Swinney Switch, fossils of a variety of organisms can be found casually along the intercoastal waterway, where they've dredged down into the Pleistocene to create the ship channel and put that dredge material onto the spoil islands. We'll have teeth and bones will wash out on the spoil islands in the mouths of different rivers and creeks that come into Copano Bay or Corpus Christi Bay, or these fossils can be found. So we do find Pleistocene fossils quite commonly in the coastal bend, along with Native American artifacts, spear points, arrowheads, pottery. There is a degree of preservation of these materials that are found casually by different people at different places. So yeah, the Blunzer site, someday, maybe in my lifetime, I hope, that there'll be some body, some professor will move into our region and say, hey, you know what, we need to be studying those megafaunal again. Because the work that was done in the 80s and 90s are reflected in some of the work that Dinah Bowman did, the chartering of that picture, and then what you might find at our Corpus Christi Museum of Science and History, what you'll see here, what you'll see up at the museum in Victoria, or at the O'Connor Museum down in Kingsville. There are some of these things that have been preserved, which are cool, but those sites right now, there's no active research in those sites, which is a real shame. But yeah, one is apt to find something, people still find mammoth teeth out on the spoil islands or anywhere where there's been some earthwork. You just don't know what's going to wash out, because these were very, like I said, they were prolific, or there weren't just a few of these guys running around. They were prolific in our area at the time. Yes, ma'am.
A couple of things. Even last month, someone brought to one of our meetings what could only have been a megalodon tooth, a
Right.
giant shark tooth that they had found near Packard Channel.
Really?
Yeah, and we're not quite sure how that got there, but I mean, that's certainly what it looked like. And then while we can't get to these actual sites, you mentioned the Cotter Museum in Kingsville, also the Owen Hopkins Library
Oh, very good.
in Calallen, they've got an assembled from the shoulder to the toe of a mammoth. And now y'all came in late, but the mammoth was 6 foot tall. A 6 foot man could walk under his belly. So imagine you get something from the shoulder to the toe, and they've got, it may not be from the same animal, but they've got an assemblage. They've also reassembled a full tusk, 18 feet long or
Yeah.
whatever. And then some other, and they've got this poster almost life size, blown up to where it's almost life size. So that's an easy, publicly free, accessible site where you can see some more of the displays. You can't touch.
Here, today you can touch, okay?
But that's, and then you have to, it's Corpus Christi Public Library, so you gotta get there when they're open, so don't just go up there willy-nilly.
So I think this is this poster, there's another number, and Dawn and I were talking about this the other day because of the number, the 13320 that's on that and why there's a number called 13320 on that diagram. That picture is intended to depict the Nueces River Valley 13,000 years ago. Now the number 13230 comes from some carbon dating that was done from some woody material that was found in the gravel deposits, along with the bones that were found in those gravel deposits in the Nueces River Valley. 13230, 13,000 years ago, you guys weren't here when we talked about it, 13,000 years ago, the Nueces River was a completely different river because sea level was 300 to 400 feet lower than it is today. It wasn't this lazy, meandering, muddy river. It was a fast-moving gravel and sandy river that was cutting a deep valley across Corpus Christi Bay. So here's a map of Corpus Christi Bay, and this is what the contour map of the valley would look like if you stripped off the water and you stripped off the Holocene sediment. What you would have had was the Nueces River occupying the bottom of this valley, not flowing like this little lazy man, but this gravel-laden stream coursing off. How many more miles to the Gulf of Mexico? 60 to 80 miles farther. And so you would have been up the river valley. And then this valley would have been teeming with that assemblage of animals, okay? And again, it would have been a cooler, drier climate with more grasslands, okay? And this ridge, this Flower Bluff and Ingleside Ridge would have been a high sand hill that would have stuck up above the landscape, okay? And so that, again, that reconstruction of this picture. But what I was going to point out, there's one thing in this picture that people often don't notice, and that's the village right there. There's people. People are in this picture. Because we know that people were in North America probably 20 to 25,000 years ago. And people were here with these organisms. And so there are people in the picture. And so mammoths, these megafauna, started to decline after 13,000 years ago. Quite the decline in their prevalence was steep. In the last, from 13,000 to about 6,000 years ago, we had the extinction decline of a lot of the Pleistocene megafauna. And, while it's debated about what may have been the actual cause, it's like, well, what really killed the dinosaurs? Was it the asteroid, or was it a whole bunch of things going on and then the asteroid? Like everything that happens in history, it's not usually one thing, right? And so what we saw at the end of the last ice age, there's a period of, it was cold, and we see this dip, and it got colder. What they call the younger dryas, it got colder, it got really cold at the end of the last Wisconsin ice age. Well, you combine that really an unbelievably inhospitable world, which is going to start to put pressure on everybody, right? Along with the advances of technology and a growing population of human beings, and the desire and ability to feed a family for a year, right? And by about 6,000 years ago, all these guys are gone. Okay? And so was it human beings that hunted mammoths to extinction? Well, human beings don't have a history of, well, we kind of do, don't we? We will drive things to extinction. But is it just us, or is it us and the other pressures? Because people who study anthropology will say, well, we took a pretty big hit in that period. I mean, the number of human beings took a pretty big hit in that period of time too. That it was hard on us, and that reduced and refined genetic distributions and populations of human beings across the planet. You know, it made it solidified some of the distinctive characteristics of people in different places because it reduced the gene pools in all these different places all over the world, and gave us you know, the modern distribution of human beings. But it probably wasn't simply human beings that caused extinction, but the pressures from natural cycles in climatic change and our advancements of technology and our own the evolution of religion and culture and civilization and technology and population all going hand in hand, right? All those things occur at the same time, and so as there's more of us, there's fewer of the things that we're competing with as predators and the things that he and I are competing with as prey. And so we end up in this situation we got. The last mammoth was around about 4,000 years ago on an island in Siberia, where the last mammoths were. There were also some in offshore California, I think, probably about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. I think those are the last two places, because mammoths could swim. Yeah, they were swimmers, you know. And so as late as 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, we had mammoths, but there are none today, just elephants. So that's kind of a fun thing to think about.
Right.
All right, well, that's been my presentation. I appreciate the video, and yeah, you can. I'm happy to talk about any of these items or any questions in general for the folks that just came in.